Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the far corner of a small diner, blending into the shadows. He seemed calm and unassuming, but his eyes, hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap, closely observed everything unfolding around him. He heard the humiliating words echoing through the room, saw the chuckles of the patrons, and noticed the young woman at the counter clutching the strap of her worn bag, trying to keep her trembling hands steady. She was hungry, exhausted, and looked as though she was at her breaking point. The waiter, scowling, spoke louder, insisting that no food was given away for free here. It seemed like the entire room was against her. In that moment, Keanu decided to act. No one in the diner expected that their indifference would soon turn into shame, and for this woman, it would become a spark of hope. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The rain fell softly on the streets of downtown Los Angeles, creating a rhythmic patter against the windows of a cozy 24-hour diner tucked between towering office buildings. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. The chatter of patrons and the clinking of utensils created a comforting hum, a stark contrast to the dreary world outside. The diner, a local favorite, was a crossroads of life. Business people grabbing quick meals, truckers taking a break, and the occasional celebrity hiding in plain sight. Tonight, the diner was busier than usual. A group of college students laughed boisterously in one corner, a young couple whispered over a shared milkshake, and a lone man in a baseball cap and sunglasses sat in the farthest booth, blending into the shadows. His unassuming demeanor made him invisible to the crowd, though a keen observer might have noticed the strong jawline and familiar, gentle smile of a Hollywood star. Keanu Reeves, in his signature understated style, had quietly slipped in, seeking solitude and a simple meal. At the counter, Sophie stood hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly around the strap of an old, frayed bag. Her clothes were clean but worn, and her eyes carried the weight of someone used to being overlooked. Sophie was no stranger to hard times. Ever since losing her job 3 months ago, she'd been scraping by, doing odd jobs and relying on the kindness of strangers. But tonight, desperation had driven her here. Her stomach growled loudly, a cruel reminder of the 2 days she'd gone without food. She glanced around the room, feeling out of place among the cheerful diners. Every step toward the counter felt heavier than the last. Sophie hesitated, unsure if she had the courage to ask for help. Behind the counter, Jason, the head waiter, was busy scribbling down an order, his sharp features pulled into a perpetual scowl. "Excuse me," Sophie began, her voice barely audible over the din of the room. Jason looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. He asked, his tone curt. Sophie swallowed hard. "I was wondering if there's any leftover food you could spare. I haven't eaten in..." Jason raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Look, lady, this is a business, not a charity," he said loudly enough for nearby patrons to hear. A few heads turned toward the scene, curiosity flickering in their eyes. In the corner booth, Keanu's gaze shifted, his relaxed posture straightening slightly. Though he kept his face neutral, his eyes followed the exchange intently, the gears of his mind quietly turning. Unaware of the attention she'd drawn, Sophie's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back. "I didn't mean to..." Jason rolled his eyes, already turning away. Yeah, just don't bother the customers." Sophie looked down at her hands, her heart sinking. All she'd wanted was a little kindness, a small reprieve from the unrelenting hardships of life. The rain outside seemed to echo her despair, tapping insistently against the glass, as if demanding anyone, to notice, and someone had. Sophie hesitated, her body frozen in place at the counter. Jason's words rang in her ears, sharper than the cold wind that had chased her into the diner. She couldn't afford to leave, not tonight, not when her hunger gnawed at her insides. Taking a shaky breath, she steadied herself and tried again. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but louder this time. "I'm not asking for much. Just anything you might throw away. I'll eat scraps if I have to." Jason stopped wiping the counter and turned back to her, an incredulous smirk creeping across his face. "Scraps?" he repeated mockingly. "You think we're running a soup kitchen here? We sell food, sweetheart, not hand it out for free." His voice carried across the room, drawing the attention of more diners. Conversations died down as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. Sophie's face burned as she felt the weight of their stares, some curious, others judgmental. A few whispered among themselves, their murmurs cutting like daggers. I'm sorry," she stammered, feeling the pressure of the room closing in on her. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, I just—" "Trouble?" Jason cut her off with a bitter laugh. "Lady, you've got a lot of nerve walking in here dressed like that, asking for free food. You think the rest of us don't have bills to pay? Rent's due for me too, you know." A few chuckles rippled through the diner, emboldening Jason further. He leaned on the counter, his expression smug. "Here's an idea," he continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "Why don't you go out there and find a job? Maybe then you wouldn't have to beg for scraps like some stray dog." The words hit Sophie like a slap. Her breath hitched, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond but found no words, only a hollow ache in her chest. Her hands gripped the strap of her bag tighter, as if holding onto it would somehow ground her. The room was silent except for the sound of Jason's voice and the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Sophie's heart raced as she felt the eyes of the diners bore into her. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged amused glances. No one stood up for her. No one said a word. In the corner booth, Keanu Reeves sat motionless, his hand frozen around his cup of coffee. His sunglasses obscured his eyes, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed his growing anger. He set his cup down carefully, the faint clink barely audible over Jason's tirade. Sophie forced herself to speak, her voice barely a whisper. I've been looking for work. I've applied everywhere I can. I'm just between jobs right now. I'll pay you back when I can, I promise." Jason rolled his eyes dramatically, stepping back from the counter and throwing his hands in the air. "Oh, great. A sob story. Haven't heard that one before." He turned toward the nearest table, addressing the customers now. "Can you believe this? We work hard to make a living, and here she is, thinking she can just waltz in and get a free meal. Unbelievable." The diners laughed awkwardly, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in her mid-30s whispered something to her partner, who shrugged and returned to his plate. No one met Sophie's tearful gaze. Jason turned back to her, his expression hardening. "Look, lady, you've wasted enough of my time. Either order something and pay for it or get out. We don't need your kind hanging around, scaring off paying customers." The words, "your kind," lingered in the air like poison. Sophie flinched as though struck, her shoulders hunching under the weight of the humiliation. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but her voice betrayed her. Instead, she took a step back, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The rain outside intensified, the droplets tapping against the diner's windows in an almost frantic rhythm. The world seemed to close in around Sophie, every exit feeling miles away. She turned toward the door, willing her feet to move. But a sudden voice stopped her in her tracks. "That's enough." The words weren't loud, but they carried an authority that cut through the tension like a knife. Every head turned toward the corner booth where the man in the baseball cap and sunglasses stood. Keanu Reeves slowly removed his glasses, revealing piercing eyes that held a quiet fire. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, the weight of his presence silencing the room. Jason blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" he said, his bravado faltering slightly. Keanu ignored him and approached Sophie, his gaze softening as he looked at her tear-streaked face. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice low and soothing. Sophie could only nod, too stunned to speak. She recognized him now, but her mind struggled to process what was happening. Keanu turned to Jason, his expression hardening. "You think it's funny to humiliate someone who's already struggling?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Jason step back instinctively. "Hey man, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm someone who doesn't stand by while people like you treat others like garbage," Keanu interrupted, his tone sharp. The room was deathly quiet, every pair of eyes glued to the unfolding confrontation. Jason opened his mouth to retort, but the weight of Keanu's gaze stopped him. He looked around the diner, searching for support, but found none. Even the diners who had laughed earlier now stared at him with thinly veiled disapproval. Keanu turned back to Sophie, his expression softening once more. "Come with me," he said gently. "You don't deserve to be treated like this." With that, he guided Sophie to his booth, pulling out a seat for her. The diners watched in stunned silence as the Hollywood star, the man they had failed to notice, made a stand for the woman they had ignored. Sophie sat down, her hands trembling. Keanu slid into the seat across from her, his expression calm but resolute. He looked up at Jason, who was still frozen in place behind the counter. "Bring her the best meal you've got," Keanu said, his voice firm. "And make it quick." Jason hesitated, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. But under Keanu's unyielding stare, he reluctantly nodded and shuffled off to the kitchen. The room remained silent, the tension thick in the air. But for the first time that night, Sophie felt a spark of hope. The tension in the diner was palpable, the air thick with an awkward silence as Jason disappeared into the kitchen, his shoulders stiff with suppressed frustration. All eyes were on the booth where Keanu Reeves sat across from Sophie, his calm demeanor an unspoken challenge to the hostility that had hung in the room moments ago. Sophie sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her body still trembling from the humiliation she had endured. She glanced up hesitantly at Keanu, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu offered her a gentle smile, his presence radiating warmth and reassurance. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly, his voice steady and kind. "No one should ever be treated the way you were just now." His words, simple yet powerful, cut through the weight of Sophie's shame. She blinked back tears, nodding slightly as she took a deep breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt seen, really seen, by someone who didn't look at her with pity or judgment. The other diners, still murmuring among themselves, couldn't help but steal glances at the man who had turned the room's energy on its head. A few whispered to each other in hushed tones, speculating on whether it was really Keanu Reeves or just someone who looked like him. But as he leaned back in his seat, his quiet confidence and unmistakable presence left little room for doubt. Jason returned from the kitchen, carrying a steaming plate of food. His face was flushed, whether from embarrassment or anger, no one could tell. He set the plate down in front of Sophie with a curt gesture, avoiding eye contact. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking on Jason with an intensity that made the waiter falter. "Is that how you serve a customer?" he asked, his tone calm but unyielding. Jason's jaw tightened and he mumbled a half-hearted, "Enjoy your meal," before retreating behind the counter. Keanu turned back to Sophie and gestured toward the plate. "Please, eat," he encouraged her. "You don't need to worry about anything else right now." Sophie hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her hunger, but the growling in her stomach and the kindness in Keanu's eyes convinced her. She picked up the fork and took a small bite, the flavors bursting on her tongue after days of emptiness. The tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilled over, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "I don't know why you did this, but thank you." Keanu rested his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together as he regarded her thoughtfully. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "I've been in tough spots before, not like yours, maybe, but enough to know how much a little kindness can mean." Sophie's brows furrowed in disbelief. "But you're famous. You could have ignored me like everyone else did." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Fame doesn't change who you are, it just makes people notice more. If I ignored you, I'd be ignoring what I believe in." His eyes softened as he added, "Sometimes the smallest actions make the biggest difference." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden movement from one of the other tables. A man in his 40s who had been watching the scene unfold stood up and approached their booth hesitantly. He looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Sophie. I couldn't help but overhear," If you need a job, my brother owns a hardware store nearby. We could use some extra help if you're interested." Sophie blinked in surprise, her lips parting as she struggled to process his words. "Really?" she stammered. The man nodded, his expression sincere. "Yeah, come by tomorrow and I'll talk to him. No promises, but it's worth a shot." Before Sophie could respond, another voice chimed in. "I'd like to help too," said a middle-aged woman sitting with her teenage daughter. "I run a bakery and we're always looking for part-time help. If you'd rather do that, just let me know." The ripple effect of Keanu's intervention had begun. The diners who had been complicit in Sophie's humiliation moments ago now looked at her with compassion and a willingness to help. One by one, they offered small gestures of kindness, spare change, words of encouragement, even a business card. Keanu watched silently, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He hadn't needed to do anything more than shine a light on what was already there, the basic decency in people's hearts, waiting to be awakened. As the room buzzed with quiet acts of generosity, Jason stood behind the counter, his face pale. He didn't meet Keanu's gaze, but the shame in his posture was unmistakable. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm as he addressed the man. "It's not too late to be better," he said, the words carrying a weight that lingered in the air. "Kindness is a choice. You should try it sometime." Jason didn't respond, but his eyes flickered with something that might have been remorse. For now, Keanu let it be. The seeds of change had been planted, and time would tell whether they would take root. Turning back to Sophie, Keanu gave her a reassuring nod. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "People care more than you think. Sometimes they just need a reminder." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sophie believed him. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted. What had begun as a scene of humiliation had transformed into a moment of quiet solidarity. Sophie, still overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers, glanced around the room. The smiles of encouragement from some patrons gave her strength, but it was the calm presence of Keanu Reeves sitting across from her that truly anchored. The plate of food in front of her, warm, hearty, and plentiful, felt like a luxury. She ate slowly at first, the weight of her emotions making each bite feel heavy. But as the meal filled her empty stomach, her trembling hands began to steady, and the knots of tension in her body started to unwind. Keanu, meanwhile, sipped his coffee, giving her space to eat. His demeanor was unassuming yet attentive, as if waiting for the right moment to speak. When Sophie finally set her fork down, he leaned forward slightly, his warm brown eyes meeting hers. "Feeling a little better?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded, her voice hesitant but steady. "Yes. I don't know what to say. I still can't believe you did this. No one's ever stood up for me like that before." Keanu gave her a faint smile, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes people forget to stand up when they see someone struggling. Not because they don't care, but because they're scared or unsure. It's easier to look away. But I've learned that the hardest moments in life are when we need each other the most." Sophie tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her weary eyes. "You make it sound so simple, but you're different. You didn't just look away." Keanu's smile turned wistful and he leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the rain-streaked window. "I'm not so different. I've had my share of struggles too. Loss, loneliness. Even when you're surrounded by people, it can still feel like no one sees you. I think that's why I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I've been there, in a way." Sophie's brow furrowed as she studied him. She had always imagined celebrities like him lived perfect, untouchable lives, far removed from the struggles of people like her. But there was a sincerity in his words that couldn't be faked. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Keanu's gaze returned to hers, and for a moment he seemed to weigh his words carefully. "I lost my best friend when I was young, then my partner and our baby years later. It changed the way I see the world. I realized how fragile life is, and how much even the smallest acts of kindness can matter." Sophie's breath caught, her heart aching at the weight of his confession. She hadn't expected someone so famous, so seemingly untouchable, to carry such pain. And yet, it was that pain, she realized, that gave his kindness its depth. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Keanu shook his head gently. It's okay. It taught me to cherish the good moments and to look out for people who need help, like you. He paused, his gaze steady and full of empathy. Your story isn't over, Sophie. You're going to get through this. Sophie blinked back tears, feeling the sincerity of his words wrap around her like a warm blanket. I've been trying so hard, she said, her voice trembling, but every door I knock on stays shut. It's like I don't even exist. You do exist, Keanu said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. You matter, and your efforts matter. Sometimes the world feels like it's against you, but that doesn't mean you're alone. Look around you. He gestured subtly toward the other diners, several of whom were still glancing her way with kind, encouraging smiles. These people didn't stand up at first, but they came around. There's more good in the world than you think. Sophie followed his gaze, her heart swelling at the sight of the bakery owner waving gently at her, the hardware store manager jotting down a phone number on a scrap of paper. It wasn't just words anymore. She felt the shift, the promise of something better. Do you really think things can change? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Keanu smiled again, a spark of warmth lighting his expression. I know they can, but change starts small. It starts with you believing in yourself again. Sophie was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She looked down at her hands, calloused and worn, then back at the man who had so effortlessly changed the trajectory of her night, and maybe her life. You're not like anyone I've ever met, she said softly. Keanu chuckled, a low, genuine sound that carried no trace of arrogance. I'm just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Sophie smiled faintly, a spark of hope igniting within her for the first time in months. Well, you being here, it means everything to me. Thank you. Keanu nodded, his gaze warm. Just remember, Sophie, you're stronger than you think, and when you're back on your feet, you'll have the chance to help someone else, too. Her smile widened, the weight of despair lifting just a little more. I will, she promised. I'll remember this, and I'll pay it forward. The rain outside began to ease, the steady downpour softening into a gentle drizzle. Inside the diner, the hum of conversation resumed, but something unspoken lingered in the air. A renewed sense of hope, sparked by the quiet hero who had simply decided to care. For Sophie, the world no longer felt quite so heavy, and for Keanu, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference was enough. Jason lingered behind the counter, pretending to busy himself with organizing receipts, but his hands trembled slightly. He couldn't shake the image of Keanu Reeves stepping up for Sophie, the raw sincerity in his voice cutting deeper than he'd expected. Every now and then, he glanced toward the booth where Sophie now sat, a faint smile on her face as she picked at her meal and spoke with Keanu. The sight made his stomach churn with guilt. The truth was, Jason hadn't always been like this. There was a time, years ago, when he might have been the one offering help to someone in need, but life had hardened him. Long hours, ungrateful customers, and the constant pressure of living paycheck to paycheck had turned him bitter. Sophie wasn't the first person he'd dismissed so callously, but tonight felt different. Tonight, someone had called him out in front of a room full of people, and it was impossible to ignore the shame that followed. As the diner settled back into its usual rhythm, Jason wiped his hands on his apron and took a deep breath. He knew what he needed to do, even if his pride resisted. After another moment of hesitation, he squared his shoulders and walked over to Sophie and Keanu's booth. Sophie looked up first, her expression wary. Jason felt his chest tighten at the sight of her tired, guarded eyes he'd contributed to dimming. Keanu leaned back in his seat, watching Jason with a calm but piercing gaze that made it impossible to look away. Hi, Jason began awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the bravado he'd worn earlier. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you. Sophie blinked in surprise, her fork pausing midair. She didn't say anything, so Jason hurried to fill the silence. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. It was wrong, and I know it, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. I've just been dealing with a lot lately, but that's no excuse. You didn't deserve it. Nobody does. Sophie hesitated, searching his face for signs of sincerity. When she saw none of the smugness or disdain from earlier, her posture relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice cautious but genuine. "That means a lot." Jason nodded, relief washing over him. He turned to Keanu, who had been silent but watchful throughout the exchange. "And, thank you, too, for calling me out. I needed it." Keanu inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me. What matters is what you do next." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jason nodded again, taking them in. "I'll do better," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." Keanu's gaze softened just a fraction. "Good. Kindness is a habit, just like anything else. It takes work, but it's worth it." Jason exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. He stood there for a moment longer, awkwardly shifting his weight, before clearing his throat. "If you ever need a meal, you can come back any time," he said to Sophie. "On the house, I mean it." Sophie's lips parted in surprise, and a faint smile broke through. "Thank you," she said again, her voice a little stronger now. Jason gave her a small, almost shy smile in return before turning and heading back to the counter. The tension in his shoulders eased as he moved, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of pride. Not the kind that came from being right or getting the last word, but from doing something right. Back at the counter, Jason began clearing plates and refilling drinks with a renewed energy. The other staff noticed the change, exchanging puzzled glances but saying nothing. Meanwhile, the diners who had witnessed the earlier scene watched with a mixture of curiosity and quiet approval. At the booth, Sophie turned to Keanu, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded, his eyes following Jason's movements. "I do. People make mistakes, but they can change if they want to. He'll have to prove it with time, but tonight was a start." Sophie smiled faintly, the weight on her heart lifting just a little more. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for the world around her. If someone like Jason could change, maybe things weren't as bleak as they seemed. Across the room, Jason caught Keanu's eye and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Keanu returned it with a hint of a smile, knowing that sometimes a little redemption could go a long way. The diner buzzed with a renewed energy, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped it earlier. Sophie finished her meal slowly, savoring not just the food, but the unexpected warmth of the moment. Keanu's quiet reassurance and Jason's apology had cracked open a door she'd thought was sealed shut, a door to hope. The diners, who had once been silent spectators, began to engage in their own small acts of kindness. The man who had offered Sophie a potential job at his brother's hardware store approached her again, this time with a handwritten address and a note of encouragement. The woman who ran the bakery added her contact information as well, promising to do her best to find a spot for Sophie if she stopped by. "Thank you," Sophie said to each of them, her voice steady but full of emotion. I didn't expect any of this." "It's the least we can do," the bakery owner replied, her smile kind. "Everyone needs help sometimes." One by one, other diners stepped forward. A young man in a hoodie offered Sophie a $20 bill, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment as he mumbled, "I know it's not much, but maybe it'll help." An elderly couple, seated near the window, slipped her a grocery store gift card they happened to have in their bag. Sophie was overwhelmed, her hands trembling as she accepted each gesture with heartfelt gratitude. She looked at Keanu, who sat quietly watching the scene unfold, his expression serene. "You did this," she said softly. Keanu shook his head, his smile faint but genuine. "I didn't do anything. People just needed a reminder of what they're capable of." Across the room, Jason, who had been refilling coffee and clearing tables, hesitated before stepping forward again. He carried a small box in his hands, something he had grabbed from the kitchen. As he approached Sophie, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I packed up some extra food for you," he said, holding the box out. "It's nothing fancy, but it should last you a couple of days." Sophie stared at him, her eyes welling with tears again. "Jason, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Jason shifted uncomfortably, but managed a small smile. Just take care of yourself, okay? The ripple effect didn't stop there. One of the college students who had initially chuckled during Sophie's humiliation stood up, her cheeks flushed with guilt. I was wrong to laugh earlier, she said, addressing Sophie directly. It was awful, and I'm sorry. I'll do better. Her words sparked murmurs of agreement from the other tables, as if the room had collectively decided to take a good hard look at itself. Apologies floated through the air, directed not just at Sophie but at one another, as if everyone wanted to wipe the slate clean. Meanwhile, unnoticed by most, another diner had quietly been filming the entire exchange on their phone. As Sophie received one gesture of kindness after another, the person smiled, knowing the story would resonate far beyond these four walls. By the time Sophie stood to leave, her arms full of food, notes, and small gifts, the energy in the room felt lighter, as though something intangible but profoundly important had shifted. She turned to Keanu, her voice breaking slightly as she said, I don't know how to repay any of you. You don't have to, Keanu replied gently. Just keep going, and when you're able, help someone else. That's how it works. Sophie nodded, her expression resolute despite the tears on her cheeks. I will. I promise. With that, she turned toward the door, her heart lighter than it had been in months. As she stepped into the rain, now little more than a soft drizzle, she glanced back at the diner one last time. Through the window, she saw Keanu watching her, his face calm and content. The ripple effects of the evening didn't stop there. The video taken by the diner patron began circulating online within hours, quickly going viral. Comments flooded in from strangers around the world, inspired by the story of a woman who had been humiliated but found kindness in unexpected places. And by the Hollywood actor who had quietly, humbly refused to let her suffer alone. Keanu Reeves proves yet again why he's the internet's favorite person, one headline read. Another wrote, small acts of kindness can change lives. But for Keanu, it was never about the attention. Long after Sophie had left and the diner had returned to its usual late-night quiet, he sat at the booth, sipping the last of his coffee. When the bill came, he left a generous tip and a note for Jason. Kindness is a choice. Keep choosing it. As he stepped into the night, disappearing into the rain-slick streets, the diner remained, and inside it, a small but undeniable shift had occurred. Kindness, sparked by one man's refusal to look away, had left its mark on everyone who had witnessed it. And like ripples on a pond, it would spread far beyond the diner's walls. The rain had stopped by the time Sophie reached the small motel where she'd been staying, her heart still pounding from the events of the night. Her hands were full, bags of food, a handful of business cards, and the few small but meaningful gifts from strangers. Yet it wasn't the items she carried that overwhelmed her. It was the realization that for the first time in months, she wasn't walking alone. Sitting on the edge of the worn bed in her tiny room, Sophie unfolded one of the cards. It was from the hardware store owner's brother, offering a chance at steady work. Another came from the bakery owner, inviting her to stop by in the morning for a trial shift. The names and numbers felt like lifelines, tangible proof that someone cared. Sophie thought about Keanu's words at the diner. You're stronger than you think, and when you're back on your feet, you'll have the chance to help someone else too. The memory brought fresh tears to her eyes. Not tears of despair, but of hope. He had believed in her when she barely believed in herself. The next day, Sophie made her way to the bakery. The owner greeted her warmly and handed her an apron. By the end of the week, Sophie had secured both a part-time job and a steady paycheck. For the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about her next meal. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie found herself slowly rebuilding her life. She saved what little she could, working harder than ever, but fueled by a sense of purpose. The kindness she had received at the diner stayed with her, a constant reminder that even in the darkest moments, a single act of compassion could change everything. One afternoon, as she left the bakery after her shift, Sophie spotted a young man sitting on the curb nearby. His clothes were worn, and the slump of his shoulders spoke volumes about his struggles. She hesitated for a moment, the memory of her own lowest point flashing through her mind. Then, with quiet determination, she walked over and sat. "Ooh, hey," she said gently, holding out a bag of pastries from her shift. "You hungry?" The man looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, and nodded. "Yeah, thanks." As he began to eat, Sophie smiled faintly, the warmth of that small act filling her chest. This was what Keanu had meant. Paying it forward wasn't about grand gestures, it was about being present when someone needed it most. Back at the diner, life went on, but something had changed. Jason, now kinder and more patient, often thought about the words Keanu had left for him. He didn't always get it right, but he tried. And it made all the difference. As for Sophie, her story was far from over. But now, she faced each day with hope, strength, and the knowledge that a single moment of kindness could change the world. Not just for her, but for anyone willing to believe in it. And that, she realized, was the most powerful gift of all.